The night was alive with the glimmer of champagne flutes and the hum of muted conversation. It was a party Emily had been looking forward to for weeks, hosted by our mutual friend Greg at his sprawling estate just outside the city. The house was a marvel, modern, sleek, and decorated with the kind of pretentious minimalism that screamed wealth. I never much cared for Greg's parties, but Emily loved them. She thrived in the limelight, mingling with socialites and flashing her perfect smile for anyone who cared to look. I wandered through the crowd, drink in hand, playing my usual role of supportive husband. Emily was somewhere, probably dazzling someone with her charm. I was used to her magnetism. She was the kind of woman people couldn't help but gravitate toward. For years, I had told myself that her flirtations were harmless, part of her personality. Tonight, though, something felt different. A little after midnight, I decided to take a break from the endless small talk. I walked out to the garden, which was dimly lit with strings of fairy lights, casting a soft glow over the manicured hedges. It was there, in the shadow of the rose trellis, that I saw them, Emily and Ryan. They were pressed close together, their bodies practically merging in the dim light. Ryan's hand rested on her waist, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered something that made her laugh. A laugh I hadn't heard in years, carefree and genuine. I stood frozen, my drink forgotten in my hand, as Ryan leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a fleeting kiss either. It was passionate, deliberate, the kind of kiss that left no room for misunderstanding. Emily must have sensed me, because her eyes darted up, locking onto mine. For a split second, her face fell, and I saw the guilt bloom there. She pulled away from Ryan, smoothing her dress, as if that could erase what I'd just witnessed. Without a word, she turned and walked briskly back into the house, leaving Ryan standing there, looking confused. I didn't follow her, couldn't. My mind was racing, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and something colder, something more dangerous. I wasn't just angry, I was calculating. By the time I returned to the party, Emily had already left. A few people noticed my absence, but I waved them off with an excuse about needing fresh air. I stayed just long enough to avoid suspicion, then called an Uber and headed home. When I walked into the house, it was silent. Emily's shoes were by the door, her coat draped over the back of a chair. She was upstairs in our bedroom, pretending to be asleep. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I poured myself a whiskey and sat in the dark, letting the events of the night replay in my mind. She thought I was upset. She thought I'd brood for a few days, maybe yell or cry or accuse her of betrayal. But as I stared into my glass, a plan began to take shape. I wasn't going to confront her, not in the way she expected. No, I was going to make her pay slowly, methodically. And by the time I was done, she wouldn't just lose me, she'd lose everything she valued. Emily didn't know it yet, but tonight was the beginning of her downfall. The morning after the party, Emily acted as if nothing had happened. She floated into the kitchen, her hair still tousled from sleep, wearing the silk robe I had bought her for our anniversary. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she poured herself a cup and sat at the table opposite me. "Did you have fun last night?" she asked, her voice casual. I took a sip of my coffee, careful to keep my expression neutral. "It was fine. You left early." Her hand twitched slightly, a crack in her facade. "Oh yeah, I wasn't feeling well. Too much champagne, I think." I nodded, letting the lie hang between us. She was testing me, gauging my reaction, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I smiled. "Maybe we should spend some time together this weekend," I said, as if the idea had just come to me, go somewhere just the two of us. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might confess. But then she smiled back, that perfect practice smile. "I'd like that." Over the next few days, I began piecing together the evidence. I wasn't about to confront her without proof. Not because I wanted to save the marriage, but because I wanted to make sure she couldn't talk her way out of it. I started with her phone. It wasn't hard to guess her passcode. It was the same one she used for everything. Late at night, while she was in the shower, I unlocked it and began my search. The first clue was in her messages. At first glance, everything looked innocent. Texts from friends, colleagues, and family. But then I found a thread with Ryan. It was buried under a fake contact name. Linda Yoga. Clever, but not clever enough. The messages were exactly what I expected. Flirty at first, then progressively more explicit. They'd been meeting for months, sneaking around under my nose while I played the oblivious husband. My hands clenched in a fist as I read, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for strategy. Next I check her email. This was trickier, but Emily wasn't as careful as she thought. She'd left her work laptop logged in, and I took full advantage. The emails were less incriminating but still damning. There were travel receipts for hotels she claimed were for work trips, suspiciously timed lunch meetings, and even a few photographs, selfies she had taken and sent to Ryan. Her expression far more intimate than anything I'd seen from her in years. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to confront her a dozen times over. But that wasn't the plan. Confrontation was too easy. The following evening, Emily brought up the weekend getaway I had suggested. "Have you thought about where we might go?" she asked, her tone light, almost hopeful. I nodded. I was thinking something simple, a cabin upstate, quiet, secluded, just the two of us. She smiled, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was probably worried about being cut off from Ryan, but she didn't dare say no. "That sounds nice," she said finally. "It'll be good to reconnect." Reconnecting wasn't what I had in mind. As the week went on, I continued gathering information. I tracked her movements, using the location sharing feature on her phone that she didn't even realize was enabled. She met Ryan twice, once for lunch at a small cafe downtown, and again at his apartment. Each time, I documented everything: photographs, timestamps, even video clips from my car parked down the street. By the time Friday rolled around, I had a dossier that could ruin her life. And yet, I felt no satisfaction. Not yet, because the real game was just beginning. That night, as we packed for our weekend getaway, Emily was unusually affectionate. She kissed me on the cheek, ran her fingers through my hair, and even offered to cook dinner. A rare occurrence. It was almost funny. She thought she was in control, that her little act would keep me in the dark. She had no idea that I knew everything. As we loaded our bags into the car the next morning, I glanced at her and smiled. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes shining with what I assumed she thought was relief. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, heading north toward the cabin. In her mind, this trip was a chance to rebuild our marriage. In mine, it was the next step in dismantling her life. The drive to the cabin was uneventful. Emily chattered about the scenery, the change of pace, how nice it would be to get away from the noise of the city. I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the attentive husband. Beneath the surface, my mind was racing. Everything I needed for the next step of my plan was already in motion, and I was counting on Emily's obliviousness to carry me through. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods. A charming two-story retreat, surrounded by tall pines and the serene quiet of nature. Emily seemed genuinely excited as we arrived, walking through the house with an enthusiasm that almost seemed innocent. "This is perfect," she said, beaming at me as she set down her bag. "Thank you for planning this." I smiled back. I thought we could both use the break. The first evening passed without incident. We cooked dinner together, drank wine by the fireplace, and even laughed, a rare sound in our marriage these days. If someone had looked in on us, they might have thought we were a happy couple, but I wasn't interested in happiness. I was laying the groundwork. As Emily drifted off to sleep in the master bedroom, I stayed awake. I sat by the fire, scrolling through my phone and checking the progress of the traps I'd already set. My first step had been to tip off Emily's boss about her inappropriate relationships. Using an anonymous email account, I'd send him copies of the explicit messages and photographs I'd found. The subject line was simple: "For your eyes only." I imagined the fallout that would follow. Emily prided herself on her professional reputation, but her career was built on trust and discretion, qualities that her affair with Ryan undermined entirely. But that was just the beginning. The second day at the cabin, I suggested we go for a hike. "There's a trail not far from here," I said, handing her a thermos of coffee. is supposed to lead to a beautiful overlook. Emily hesitated, her discomfort with outdoor activities evident. She wasn't the hiking type, but she smiled and agreed. The hike was strenuous, and Emily struggled to keep up, her breaths coming in short gasps as we climbed the steep incline. I stayed just ahead of her, guiding her along the trail, my phone buzzing occasionally in my pocket. Each vibration was another piece of my plan falling into place. By the time we reached the overlook, Emily was exhausted. She sat on a rock, staring out at the sprawling forest below. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "I'm glad we came here." I sat beside her, the perfect picture of a devoted husband, and handed her a bottle of water. "It is," I agreed, my tone calm. "It makes you think about what really matters." She glanced at me, something flickering in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear. I wasn't sure, and I didn't care. That evening, back at the cabin, I received a phone call from a close friend of ours, Matt. I put the call on speaker, making sure Emily could hear every word. "John, have you seen the news?" Matt asked, his voice urgent. "No," I replied, feigning ignorance. "What's going on?" "It's about Ryan," Matt said. "Some pretty nasty stuff leaked online. Emails, pictures, it's all over the place. People are saying he's been having an affair. Do you know anything about it?" Emily froze, her face draining of color. I could see the panic building in her eyes, but she said nothing. "No idea," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's surprising. He always seemed like a stand-up guy." "Yeah, well, not anymore," Matt said grimly. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know. Talk later." As the call ended, Emily excused herself to the bathroom. I heard her muffled voice as she frantically made a call, no doubt trying to reach Ryan. She didn't know I'd been monitoring her phone all along. Her call didn't go through. Ryan wasn't answering. Of course he wasn't. He was too busy dealing with his own fallout. Later that night, Emily returned to the living room, her face pale and drawn. "Is everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just tired," she said. I didn't press her. I wanted her to stew in her anxiety, to wonder how much I knew, how much was coincidence, and how much was by design. As she went to bed, I stayed up again, making one last call to a lawyer I'd already retained. By the time this weekend was over, Emily's humiliation would be public, her career would be in jeopardy, and her relationship with Ryan would be in tatters. And she still had no idea what was coming next. The final morning at the cabin started quietly. Emily moved around the kitchen with a distracted air, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous energy. She burned the toast and didn't seem to notice. Her eyes kept darting to her phone, waiting for a message or a call that wouldn't come. I pretended not to notice. "We should head back early," I said casually over coffee. "I have a lot of work to catch up on." She nodded quickly, her relief palpable. She wanted to get back to the city, back to her comfort zone. But she didn't realize that her comfort zone was about to collapse. We arrived home by late afternoon, and Emily all but ran inside. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I could hear the frantic tapping of her fingers on her phone, calling, texting, searching for answers. I left her alone. Instead, I settled into my office and opened my laptop. The dominoes were falling perfectly. My anonymous tip to Emily's boss had caused a ripple effect that morning. Her company had already put her on suspension, pending an internal investigation. Ryan, meanwhile, had been forced to step down from his position after his affair with a married woman. A detail I'd made sure to emphasize in my email to his board of directors became public knowledge. I knew Emily would eventually check her work email and discover the suspension notice. I didn't have to wait long. Her scream of frustration echoed through the house a few hours later. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. "What's wrong?" I asked, fainting concern. She looked up at me, her eyes red. "It's work," she said, her voice trembling. "There's been a misunderstanding. Something's leaked and they're blaming me." I frowned, sitting beside her. "What things?" She hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell me. "Just emails, photos. This is not what it looks like." I tilted my head, my expression carefully blank. What does it look like? Her silence was damning. That evening, I convinced Emily to come with me to a charity gala we'd committed to weeks ago. She was hesitant. Her nerves clearly frayed, but I insisted. It'll be good to get out, I said. You can't let work stress control your life. The gala was exactly the kind of event Emily usually loved. Glamorous, high profile, and filled with people she wanted to impress. But tonight, she was a shadow of her usual self. She barely smiled, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I excused myself halfway through the event, slipping into a private corner to make a final move. My contact at a local gossip column, a sleazy but reliable blogger who owed me a favor, confirmed that the article was live. The headline was "Brutal Power Couple Crumbles. High-profile affair rocks elite social circles." By the time I returned to the ballroom, the whispers had already started. I watched as phones lit up, the news spreading like wildfire. It wasn't long before people began glancing at Emily, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment. She noticed too. Her eyes darted around the room, her panic building with every passing second. When one of her closest friends approached her with a sympathetic but pointed question. "Is it true?" Emily froze. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. But the damage was done. The ride home was silent. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. I said nothing, letting the weight of the evening settle over her. When we got home, she finally broke. "Did you know?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Know what?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "About the article, the photos, everything." Her voice cracked and tears streamed down her face. I shrugged. I saw it when everyone else did. Her face twisted with despair, but I felt nothing. No pity, no regret. This was what she deserved. The next morning, Emily woke up to more bad news. Her suspension had escalated to termination, effective immediately. Her personal bank account had been frozen. Another step I had orchestrated through our shared financial planner, under the guise of protecting our assets. She spent the day locked in the bedroom, frantically calling anyone who would listen. But her calls went unanswered, her messages ignored. Her friends, her colleagues, even Ryan, they'd all abandoned her. By evening, she emerged pale and defeated. She looked at me with pleading eyes. "John, I don't know what to do." I looked back at her, my expression cold. "Figure it out." For the first time, the reality of her situation seemed to hit her. She wasn't just losing her reputation, her career, and her affair. She was losing me. Emily was unraveling, and I could see the cracks forming in her once perfect exterior. Days passed and she barely left the bedroom. She spent hours on the phone, trying to salvage her reputation and career, but it was no use. Every door she tried to open was slammed shut. The next phase of my plan involved ensuring she had no safety net to fall back on. While Emily had always enjoyed the lifestyle our dual incomes afforded, she wasn't as involved in our finances as I was. She had no idea that I had quietly transferred all our joint savings into a separate account weeks ago, leaving her with nothing but the illusion of stability. When she finally attempted to use her card for an online purchase, no doubt retail therapy, to soothe her battered ego, the call came almost immediately. "John," she yelled from the living room, her voice shrill with panic. I walked in, fainting confusion. "What's wrong?" "My card isn't working," she said, holding it up as though it were a broken toy. "I just tried to make a payment, and it was declined." I frowned. "That's strange. Let me check." Sitting at the kitchen table, I pulled out my laptop and logged into the account. Or rather, I logged into the empty shell that I'd left for her to see. "Looks like there's a hold on the account," I said, pointing at the screen. "It must be the bank. They've been cracking down on fraud lately. I'll give them a call." Emily slumped onto the couch, holding her head in her hands. "What else can go wrong?" she muttered. I almost laughed. The following day, I put my divorce attorney in touch with hers. Emily had been too preoccupied with the chaos in her personal and professional life to realize that I'd already filed the papers. When the courier arrived with the documents, she stared at them as though they were in another language. "You're divorcing me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. I think it's for the best." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. What could she say? She'd ruined everything, and deep down I think she knew it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Emily fought for what she thought she was entitled to, but she quickly realized that I'd been one step ahead of her at every turn. The house? I'd already refinanced it in my name. The car? It was leased under my company, leaving her with nothing but her personal belongings. Her once flawless credit score plummeted as I strategically redirected our debts. She hadn't noticed before, but many of the credit cards were in her name. She assumed I'd been paying them off, but I'd stopped months ago, allowing the balances to balloon. Now, with no income and no access to the accounts she once shared with me, she was drowning in debt. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills she couldn't pay. Her shoulders were slumped, and her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, only to hang up again a moment later. "Who were you going to call?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She flinched, startled by my presence. "No one," she said quickly, her voice hollow. I stepped closer, crossing my arms. "Ryan, maybe?" Her head shot up, her eyes wide with guilt. "Don't bother," I said coldly. "He's broke too. Lost his job, his reputation, and probably his marriage by now. You two deserve each other." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. "You did this to yourself, Emily," I continued. "You threw away everything we had for what? A fling? Some cheap thrill? I didn't mean for it to happen." She sobbed. I laughed bitterly. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You planned it. You lied, cheated, and betrayed me over and over again. You don't get to play the victim now." That night, I slept in the guest room while Emily cried herself to sleep. It should have been satisfying, watching her suffer the consequences of her actions. And in some ways it was. But there was a hollowness to my victory that I hadn't anticipated. I had destroyed her, just as I'd planned. But what had I really gained? Emily was broken, and I was alone. The revenge had been perfect, but it wasn't enough. And as I lay there in the dark, I realized something unsettling. I had spent so much time plotting her downfall that I'd forgotten to think about what came next. Emily was a shell of the woman she once was. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale, her energy drained. The spark she once carried, the same spark that had drawn me to her years ago, was completely extinguished. She tried to talk to me several times, her words wavering between apologies and desperate attempts to explain. Each time I gave her nothing but silence. It wasn't that I didn't want to hear her excuses. It was that I didn't care anymore. The divorce papers were signed within weeks. The court, swayed by the overwhelming evidence I had presented, proof of her infidelity, her financial recklessness, and her moral failings, granted me almost everything. Emily was left with the bare minimum. Enough money to cover a few months of rent on a modest apartment and the tarnished remains of her reputation. But I wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I sent her a letter. It wasn't long, just a single page, but every word was calculated. "Dear Emily, you probably think you've hit rock bottom by now, but I wanted to make sure you truly understood what happened and why. I saw you that night at Greg's party. I saw you with Ryan under the rose trellis, kissing him like I didn't exist. You looked so happy, so free. Did it even cross your mind that I might see you? Did you care? At first, I was angry, furious. I wanted to scream, to confront you, to demand answers. But then I realized something. You weren't worth my anger. You weren't worth the pain. What you were worth, however, was my revenge. Everything you've lost, your career, your friends, your security, it wasn't bad luck. It was me. I made sure every piece of your perfect little life crumbled. And the best part? You handed me the tools to do it. I gave you everything, Emily. I trusted you, loved you, and you threw it all away for what? A man who used you just like you used me. Now you're alone, just like I was when you betrayed me. Goodbye, Emily. I hope you think of me every time you see what you've become. John. The first didn't expect a response. I wasn't looking for one. The letter wasn't for her. It was for me. A final exorcism of the betrayal that had poisoned our marriage. But 2 days later, she called. The number was one I didn't recognize, likely from her new apartment. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "John," she said, her voice trembling. "Emily," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I got your letter," she began. "I don't even know what to say. I know I deserve everything that's happened. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. But what now? What now?" I repeated, almost amused. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "You've taken everything from me. I don't have a job, a home, a life. Is this what you wanted? To destroy me completely?" I was silent for a moment, considering her words. "Yes," I said finally. "That's exactly what I wanted." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I hope it was worth it." And then she hung up. Her words lingered with me more than I cared to admit. At first, I brushed them off as the desperate plea of a broken woman. But over time, they began to gnaw at me. Was it worth it? The answer should have been simple. She betrayed me. She destroyed our marriage. She deserved everything she got. But the truth was murkier. In my quest for revenge, I had become someone I barely recognized. Calculating, ruthless, cold. I had won, but at what cost? Months passed. I heard from mutual friends that Emily had moved to a small town upstate, working as a waitress to make ends meet. Ryan had vanished from the social scene entirely. As for me, I tried to move on. I threw myself into my work, my hobbies, my friends. But no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling in my chest. Revenge had been sweet, but it wasn't fulfilling. And in the end, I realized the truth of the matter. Revenge doesn't heal wounds. It just leaves you bleeding in a different way. Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to hit the like button. It only takes a second, but it means a world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos, and hit the notification bell to be among the first to see it. See you in the next video.